I inherited a piano to bury the past, only to find it composing a future I couldn't claim. But this music wasn't random. It was achingly deliberate and impossibly perfect. And the only way she could reach me was to write notes that glowed like frozen starlight on manuscript paper every midnight. The Victorian house was supposed to be my penance. For 3 floors of shadowed wood paneling and dust-thick silence tucked into a neighborhood where my father's name still meant shame and the historical society didn't return my calls, I couldn't restore. After 6 months of fruitless archive diving, watching my academic reputation wither into whispered doubts, I needed this inherited space like absolution. I moved in on a Friday. By Saturday, I'd arranged my father's effects with archaeological reverence. Composition books chronologically ordered, conducting batons displayed like relics. His awards positioned strategically to catch what little light penetrated the heavy curtains. The grand piano dominated the parlor like an accusation. The silence judged me. That first night, I sat on the worn bench, unable to touch the keys, listening to floorboards settle and my own breathing echo off the vaulted ceiling. The manuscript paper on the piano's music stand lay blank and expectant in the November cold, edges curling slightly, as if impatient. I stared at its emptiness until exhaustion finally pulled me under in the nearby armchair. I woke to find someone had been composing while I slept. The manuscript paper glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, not with reflected light, but from within. Notes had appeared on the staff lines, not penciled or penned, not the hasty scrawl of inspiration or careful plotting of craft, for bars of perfectly rendered measures, luminescent and precise, written with impossible beauty in ink that shouldn't exist. I stared at them for 7 whole minutes, my hands trembling against the armrests. Then I told myself I'd done it in some fugue state, some desperate delusion, my unconscious mind projecting my father's genius where mine failed. I grabbed the pages, shoved them in a drawer, and tried to forget them, my hands shaking. The next morning, new measures had appeared on a fresh sheet of paper. By the 3rd night, when the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath crystallized in clouds, I stopped pretending. I watched from the doorway as she materialized, a figure of ethereal light and profound sorrow, hair flowing like pale water, hands moving over the sheet music without ever touching it. She was writing a song, note by impossible note, and it was the most hauntingly beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. She looked up once. Our eyes met across the darkened room. In that moment, I understood 2 truths simultaneously. This music could save my father's legacy, and it would destroy me to use it. Because this song wasn't mine, it never had been. And somewhere in the deepening cold of that old Victorian parlor, I realized my father had known this ghost, and had known her work, and had made his entire career on the back of that knowledge. The manuscript paper continued to glow. The melody continued to write itself. And I sat frozen between redemption and repetition, watching a ghost compose the truth my family had spent decades trying to bury. For 3 days, I told myself the composition was mine, some hidden reserve of my father's talent finally surfacing through genetic memory, my subconscious channeling his genius in the vulnerable hours before dawn. It was a comfortable delusion. Insane, certainly, but comfortable in the way drowning must feel once you stop fighting. The manuscript pages multiplied with clinical precision. 4 bars became 8. 8 became a whole movement. The notation was flawless. No hesitation marks, no erasures, no evidence of human trial and error. Just pure, crystallized sorrow transcribed with the kind of technical mastery that takes decades to cultivate. I recognized the genius immediately. The harmonic progressions alone suggested someone who'd studied the late Romantics obsessively, who'd internalized Rachmaninoff's architecture and Chopin's emotional precision and somehow synthesized them into something wholly original. That recognition terrified me more than the glowing ink or the impossible cold, because I knew what genius looked like. I'd spent 6 years documenting my father's version of it, cataloging every brilliant measure he'd allegedly composed. And this was better. This was the kind of music that could rehabilitate a ruined name. The kind that could make the academic establishment forget their whispered doubts and posthumously crown my father the misunderstood master I'd always claimed he was. I just had to claim it first. Elena answered on the fourth ring, her voice rough with sleep and suspicion. Art, it's 6 in the morning. Someone better be dead. I need you to look at something. My fingers traced the spectral notes, still faintly luminescent in the dawn light. I found a composition. In my father's papers. It's, Elena, I think it might be his masterwork. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she'd hung up. Then, I'll be there in an hour. She arrived in 45 minutes, hair still damp from a hasty shower, carrying the enormous coffee she knew I'd need. Elena Shaw moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her own talent, never had to prove herself against a ghost. We'd met at the conservatory, her soaring soprano, my desperate scholarship, and somehow maintained an unlikely friendship built on her pragmatism and my obsession. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Show me. I spread the manuscript across the piano's surface, watching her face as she absorbed the first measures. Her expression shifted through a dozen micro-emotions: curiosity, concentration, disbelief. Then something settled in her features that looked almost like grief. Art. Her fingers hovered above the notes, not quite touching. Where did you really find this? I told you. My father's. Your father couldn't have written this. She looked up, and her eyes held a strange mixture of pity and wonder. This is too honest. Too raw. Your father's work was technically brilliant, sure, but it was always calculated. Controlled. This is... She trailed off, reading deeper into the score. This is someone's soul bleeding on a paper. Someone who'd lost everything and was trying to remember what it felt like to hope. The room temperature dropped by 5 degrees. My breath crystallized. Elena didn't seem to notice, too absorbed in the melody taking shape in her mind. I need to sing this, she whispered. Art, I need to sing this. And watching her hunger mirror my own, I understood that the ghost song had already begun claiming its second victim. Elena moved into the house 3 days later, not physically but spiritually. She arrived each evening at dusk, score clutched like scripture, and we'd work until the small hours when exhaustion or something else drove her away. The pattern became ritual. She'd stand by the piano. I'd sit in the worn leather chair my father had favored, and she'd breathe life into the ghost's mathematics. The first time Elena sang the opening measures, the room transformed. Her voice caught the melody's grief and amplified it, each note precise, yet emotionally devastating. I watched, transfixed, as she navigated the complex intervals, and then I saw her. The ghost materialized between one breath and the next, translucent and radiant, seated at the piano as if she'd always been there. Her hands moved over fresh manuscript paper, adding new measures while Elena sang the old ones, creating a collaboration that spanned the boundary between worlds. Elena's eyes were closed. She didn't see the temperature plummet, didn't see her breath fog the air, didn't see the spectral figure writing desperately, frantically, as if Elena's voice was the only thing keeping her tethered to this realm. But she felt something. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers trembled slightly against the music stand. When the last note faded, Elena opened her eyes. Someone else is here. It wasn't a question. I should have denied it, should have laughed off her intuition as artistic sensitivity. Instead, I heard myself say, every night at midnight. She writes more. The composition isn't finished. Elena's expression shifted into something I couldn't read. You said you found this in your father's papers. I lied. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. I don't know who she is. I don't know what she wants. But she's been here since I arrived, and she's writing something that could change everything. Elena should have left. Should have grabbed her coat and fled this haunted house and my desperate schemes. Instead, she moved closer to the piano and placed one hand on its polished surface. Then we need to know her story. We started that night. While Elena practiced in the parlor, her voice calling to whatever spirit lingered in the walls, I descended into the basement archives. Decades of documents moldered in the darkness. Property deeds, tax records, yellowed newspaper clippings. I searched for any mention of a female pianist, a composer, or anyone connected to this house who might explain the supernatural collaboration unfolding above my head. The deeper I dug, the colder the basement became. By 3 a.m, I traced the house's ownership back 7 decades, through 3 families, none with obvious musical connections. My fingers were numb, my eyes burning, but I couldn't stop. Somewhere in these records was the ghost's name, her history, the reason she'd chosen my inheritance as her confessional. Upstairs, Elena's voice soared through another passage. The melody had grown more complex, more urgent. More pages were appearing. And in the glacial darkness of the basement, surrounded by my family's archived sins, I began to suspect that what I was about to discover would require me to choose between the truth and everything I'd spent my life trying to prove. I found the first clue on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside my father's 1957 appointment diary, a single brass key, small and ornate, wrapped in a ribbon that had once been white. When I lifted it, the scent hit me, violets and something more profound, earthier. The same perfume that had begun permeating the parlor during Elena's rehearsals, so subtle I'd convinced myself I was imagining it. The key unlocked a drawer in my father's desk that I'd assumed was merely stuck. Inside, letters, dozens of them, written in an elegant hand on cream-colored stationery. No signature, just initials at the bottom. YH. The dates span 1955 to 1958, and they documented a creative partnership that made my stomach turn. Your sonata in D minor is transcendent, one letter read. I've never heard anything so honest. When you play it for the conservatory board, they'll have no choice but to grant you the commission. But my father's sonata in D minor, the work that had launched his career, that had secured his position at the university, premiered in 1959, a year after the letters stopped. I pulled every composition my father claimed as his own, cross-referencing them with the dates in the correspondence. The timeline aligned with sickening precision. His creative drought of 1953 to 1954 was well documented in published interviews. Then these letters, discussing works in progress, asking for his feedback and trusting his judgment. Then silence. Then, suddenly, my father's miraculous renaissance, a flood of compositions that critics called surprisingly mature and emotionally complex beyond his previous work. The ghost had been leaving me breadcrumbs all along. The antique key appeared where I'd find it. The perfume grew stronger as I got closer to the truth. The way specific passages in her midnight compositions echoed, too precisely, the themes in my father's most celebrated works. When Elena arrived that evening, I'd already hidden the letters in a locked cabinet and buried the key in my coat pocket. She found me at the piano, my father's published scores spread across the surface. "You look terrible," she said, setting down her coffee. "Did you find something?" "Dead ends." The lie came easily, smoothly, like I'd been practicing it. The previous owners were merchants, no musical connection. I'm starting to think she's not connected to the house at all. Maybe she's drawn to the piano itself. Elena studied me with those two perceptive eyes. "Art. Let's focus on the music." I gathered the scores hastily, not wanting her to see what I was seeing. The theft, the betrayal, the systematic appropriation of someone else's genius. "You mentioned the second movement was giving you trouble." She didn't push, but I felt her doubt like a physical weight. That night, as she sang and the ghost wrote, I watched them both with new understanding. The melody the ghost composed carried an accusation in every measure. She wasn't creating something new. She was reconstructing something stolen, piece by piece, note by note. And every page that appeared in that manuscript was another count in an indictment I couldn't let see the light of day. Because if this music was plagiarized, then everything was. My father's entire legacy, the reputation I devoted my life to defending, was built on the silenced work of the woman whose ghost now haunted his piano. I couldn't tell Elena. Couldn't risk her refusing to perform. Couldn't lose the one chance I had to transform this disaster into triumph. If I could present the completed work as a newly discovered collaboration, a previously unknown partnership, I could rewrite the narrative. Save the legacy. Bury the truth under a more palatable fiction. The ghost looked up from her composition. For one terrible moment, our eyes met, and I saw that she knew exactly what I was planning. She smiled, sad, knowing, disappointed, and returned to her work. She would give me enough rope to hang myself, just like my father before me. The composition accelerated with vengeful urgency. What had been 4 bars a night became complete movements, sometimes appearing in the hours I slept, sometimes materializing while I watched. The ghost no longer waited for Elena's voice to anchor her presence. She wrote constantly, obsessively, filling page after page with notation so technically demanding that Elena spent hours deciphering each new section. I stopped sleeping properly, stopped returning calls from the university asking about my research timeline. My entire existence contracted to the parlor, the piano, and the ever-growing manuscript that was becoming less an invitation and more an indictment. I cataloged each new page with academic precision, cross-referencing the melodic themes against my father's published works, finding echoes and mirrors in composition after composition. The evidence of theft was overwhelming, undeniable, and I documented every instance while simultaneously planning how to obscure it. Elena started arriving earlier and staying later, dark circles blooming under her eyes. The music was changing her. I watched it happen in incremental devastations, the way her hands shook before each rehearsal, the way she'd pause mid-phrase as if the melody had struck her physically, the way she sometimes finished a passage and stood frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. "I don't understand," she said one night, voice hoarse from 3 hours of continuous practice. "Every time I sing this, I feel like I'm mourning someone I've never met, like I'm apologizing for something I didn't do." She touched the manuscript with trembling fingers. "Art, whose grief is this?" "The composer's," I said, which was true and completely inadequate. "But your father," she stopped, shook her head. "Your father's work never felt like this. Even his Requiem masses had a certain detachment. This is someone who lost everything. Someone who was betrayed so profoundly that the only language left was music." The temperature dropped. The ghost materialized, more solid than I'd ever seen her, and began writing the climactic movement. Her hands moved with desperate speed, filling staves with impossible intervals and heart-wrenching harmonies. Elena watched, finally seeing what I'd been witnessing for weeks. "She's here," Elena whispered. "She's been here the whole time, hasn't she?" I couldn't answer. The ghost paused in her composition, turned to look at Elena with an expression of such profound sadness that I felt it like a weight on my chest. Then she returned to writing, faster now, as if running out of time. Elena moved to the piano and began sight-reading the fresh measures. Her voice cracked on the first note, but she pushed through, and the sound that emerged was devastating. The melody demanded everything: technical mastery, emotional vulnerability, absolute honesty. It was a song that couldn't be faked, couldn't be performed with detachment or artifice. It required the singer to embody the composer's pain, to become a vessel for grief that had waited decades for release. By the end of the passage, Elena was weeping openly, and I understood with terrible clarity what the ghost was doing. She wasn't just composing music. She was creating a confession machine, a melody so emotionally truthful that anyone who performed it would instinctively understand its origin story. Elena was singing the evidence of my father's crime, feeling it in her bones, even if her conscious mind hadn't yet assembled the pieces. The ghost finished the movement and looked at me. Her smile was pitiful, knowing she'd trapped me perfectly. I could premiere this masterwork and watch Elena's performance reveal the theft to everyone who heard it. Or I could bury it and condemn myself to the same silence that had destroyed its actual creator. Either way, the truth would surface. Either way, I would have to choose. I stopped shaving, stopped changing clothes with any regularity. My father had always been meticulous about appearance. Still, in the weeks before his death, when the plagiarism accusations had begun circulating in academic circles, he'd let himself deteriorate into a gaunt, paranoid shadow. I found myself mirroring that decline without conscious decision, as if his ghost inhabited me more thoroughly than the woman's inhabited the piano. The manuscript pages were everywhere now. I'd moved them from the piano to the dining table, then to the floor, creating careful arrangements that only I understood. Elena wasn't allowed to touch them unsupervised. I'd snapped at her twice for attempting to reorganize the sequence, my voice sharp with a possessiveness that startled us both. The music was mine to control, mine to interpret, mine to present to the world in precisely the way I determined. "You need to eat something," Elena said, standing in the parlor doorway with takeout I hadn't ordered. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I'm fine." I didn't look up from the score I was annotating, cross-referencing melodic patterns against my father's compositional techniques, building my defense, and constructing the narrative. "You're not fine. You're obsessed." She set the food on the only clear surface left, a small table by the window. "Art, I'm worried about you. This music, it's consuming you the same way it's consuming me, but you're letting it. You're choosing this. Because it matters." The words came out harder than intended. This composition could rehabilitate everything. My father's name, his work, his legacy, everything those academic vultures tried to destroy. What if they were right? The silence that followed was glacial. I finally looked up, and Elena took an involuntary step back from whatever she saw in my expression. "What did you say?" "The music, Art. Every time I sing it, I feel like I'm channeling someone who was wronged. Someone who was silenced. What if?" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "What if this isn't your father's work? What if it never was?" I stood, and she flinched. The realization that I'd become someone who made Elena Shaw flinch should have stopped me. Instead, it fueled something darker. "You don't understand what you're saying. My father was a genius. Flawed, certainly, but brilliant. This music proves it. This music proves someone was brilliant. But Art, I've been singing these notes for weeks. This isn't the voice of a man protecting his reputation. This is the voice of someone screaming into the void, someone whose entire existence was erased." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I think she's trying to tell us what happened. And I think you already know. The song is pure art." My voice had taken on a quality I didn't recognize, cold, dismissive, frighteningly controlled. Whatever emotional projection you're experiencing is your own interpretation. Don't contaminate the work with amateur psychology. Amateur psychology? Elena's expression shifted from concern to something more complex. "Listen to yourself. You sound exactly like the descriptions of your father in those final months. Defensive, paranoid, willing to sacrifice anything to maintain the illusion. Get out. Art. Get out." The shout echoed through the house, and in its aftermath, I heard the piano. A single note, struck by invisible hands. Then another. The ghost was playing for the first time, not writing but performing, and the melody was accusatory. Mocking. A mirror held up to show me what I'd become. Elena grabbed her coat, her hands shaking. "When you're ready to stop lying. To me, to yourself, to her, call me. But I won't be part of this anymore. I won't sing a stolen legacy." The door closed behind her, and I stood alone in the parlor surrounded by pages of evidence I'd spent weeks trying to reframe as vindication. The ghost continued playing, each note a question I refused to answer. I had become my father, and unlike him, I couldn't even claim ignorance as an excuse. I found her name 3 days after Elena left, scrawled in the margin of a 1958 conservatory program I'd somehow missed in my earlier searches. Debut recital, Eleanor Hayes, piano and composition. The program listed 4 original works, all scheduled for premiere that spring. The recital never happened. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Canceled due to illness." But Eleanor Hayes hadn't been ill. She'd been erased. I traced her through fragmentary records, a scholarship award in 1954, a single published review praising her extraordinary technical skill and profound emotional depth, a faculty recommendation letter calling her the most promising young composer of her generation. Then nothing. No graduation record, no subsequent performances, no published works. Just silence where a career should have been. The timeline was damningly precise. Eleanor Hayes's last documented appearance, May 1958. My father's first major commission, September 1958. The Sonata in D minor, the work that had launched everything, premiered that December. I pulled every box from the basement, ripping through decades of accumulated paper with something approaching madness. There had to be more. Some explanation that didn't end with my father as a thief and me as his accomplice in historical revisionism. But each document I found only tightened the noose. A newspaper clipping about a promising young composer who'd withdrawn from the conservatory for personal reasons. A faculty meeting note mentioning unfortunate circumstances and protecting the institution's reputation. The careful, institutional language of a cover-up. Then, wedged behind a false panel in my father's desk, a panel I'd never known existed, I found the original score. Eleanor Hayes's name was written at the top in her elegant hand, the same handwriting from the letters I'd hidden. Below it, crossed out so violently the pen had torn the paper, and replaced in my father's blocky script, Arthur Vance, Sonata in D minor. The rest of the manuscript was there too. All 4 of the works listed in that canceled recital program, each bearing Eleanor's original attribution and subsequently claimed by my father. I held the physical evidence of systematic theft, and with it, the destruction of everything I'd spent my adult life defending. I sat on the basement floor, surrounded by proof of my father's crime, and felt something break inside me. No surprise. I'd known, hadn't I? Since the first glowing note appeared, some part of me had understood. But knowing and seeing the evidence were different animals. This was concrete, undeniable, the kind of documentation that would obliterate my father's reputation permanently and reveal me as either a fool or a collaborator. The ghost appeared beside me, more solid than I'd ever seen her, and I finally understood that Eleanor Hayes wasn't haunting the house. She was haunting me, waiting for me to make the same choice my father had faced decades ago. Admit the truth and lose everything, or bury it deeper and lose myself. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though whether to her or to Elena or to some version of myself I could never reclaim, I didn't know. She didn't respond, just placed one translucent hand on the stolen score, her touch leaving frost on paper that had waited decades to speak its truth. Then she pointed upward, toward the parlor, toward the piano, toward the unfinished composition that was her testimony. The music wasn't revenge. It was her last chance to exist, and I was her last chance to be heard. I gathered the evidence, every letter, every score, every damning document, and climbed the basement stairs with the weight of 2 ghosts on my shoulders, my father's legacy and Eleanor's justice. I couldn't save both. The choice had always been inevitable. I'd just been too desperate to see it. The debut was scheduled for 8 o'clock the following evening. I'd arranged everything weeks ago, back when I still believed I could control the narrative. A small venue, select audience of academics and critics, Elena's voice bringing my father's rediscovered masterwork to life. The invitations had gone out. The program was printed. Arthur Vance's name appeared nowhere in the credits, only his son's as curator of the estate. I'd called Elena that afternoon, left a voicemail I knew she wouldn't answer. "I need you tomorrow night. Please. One performance. Then I'll tell you everything." My voice had cracked on the last word, betraying the fracture running through everything I'd built. Now midnight approached, and I sat in the parlor surrounded by Eleanor's stolen scores, waiting for what I knew was coming. The temperature dropped with familiar precision. The lights dimmed, and Eleanor Hayes materialized at the piano more vividly than ever before. So solid, she almost seemed alive, her lengthy hair catching impossible light, her face etched with decades of silent anguish. She positioned her hands over the keys, not touching, never touching, and began to write the final movement. The manuscript pages glowed as notation appeared, faster than I could follow, a cascade of measures that built towards something enormous and devastating. This wasn't just music anymore. It was a reckoning transcribed in quarter notes and key changes, a testimony written in the only language she had left. The melody that emerged even without sound was overwhelming. I could see it in the intervals, feel it in the harmonic progressions, a crescendo that started with quiet grief and built towards something like rage, like accusation, like the desperate cry of someone who'd been silenced too long and would not die quiet again. I stood, moving toward the piano without conscious thought. "Eleanor, please." She didn't acknowledge me, just kept writing, faster, more frantically, filling page after page with the capstone of her testimony. The final movement that would make everything undeniable. The piece that would force anyone who heard it to understand precisely what had been done to her. I reached for the manuscript, some desperate instinct to stop this, to preserve the illusion just a little longer. My hand passed through her shoulder like mist, through the glowing paper, through everything. She was here, but untouchable, present but beyond my ability to control, silence, or bargain with. She finished the final measure and lifted her hands from the phantom keys. Then, slowly, she turned to look at me. The sorrow in her eyes was bottomless, not anger, not hatred, just profound, aching sadness. She'd written her truth, and tomorrow I would have to choose whether to let it be heard or bury it as my father had buried her. "I can't," I whispered. "If I tell the truth, everything he was." She shook her head slightly. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but understood completely. "He was nothing. I was everything. And you know it." The manuscript pages lay across the piano, the composition finally complete. A masterwork written by a ghost, stolen once by my father, and now mine to steal again or to release. Eleanor's form began to fade, growing translucent, but her eyes remained fixed on me, waiting and judging and hoping, impossibly, that I might choose differently than the man who destroyed her. The clock struck midnight. In 20 hours, I would stand before an audience and introduce a piece of music that would either perpetuate the greatest lie of my life or destroy the only legacy I'd ever known. Eleanor disappeared, but her final composition remained, glowing softly in the darkness. The last testament of a woman who'd been erased, and the first test of whether I had inherited only my father's worst traits or somehow retained the capacity to do what he never could. Choose truth over legacy. Choose her voice over his silence. Choose to be haunted by honesty rather than complicity. Elena arrived at the venue an hour before the curtain. I'd almost convinced myself she wouldn't come, but there she was, wearing the deep blue dress she saved for essential performances, her face carefully neutral as she reviewed the complete manuscript for the first time. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the weeks of silence between us. Just read through Eleanor's final movement with the focused intensity that had always defined her artistry. The audience filed in, professors who'd known my father, critics who'd written his obituaries, musicologists who defended his reputation against the plagiarism whispers. 50 people who represented everything I'd spent my life trying to preserve. 50 witnesses to whatever I chose to do in the next hour. I sat in the front row, Eleanor's stolen scores in a folder on my lap. The original manuscripts with her name crossed out, the letters documenting her creative process, the conservatory program advertising a debut that never happened. Physical proof of erasure. All I had to do was keep quiet, let Elena sing, and allow the performance to speak for itself. The music was transcendent. It would secure my father's legacy as a complicated genius, and no one would ever know about Eleanor Hayes. The lights dimmed. Elena stepped to the microphone, positioned beside the piano where a recording would provide accompaniment. She looked out into the darkness, and for one moment, her eyes found mine. In that look was a question, a challenge, maybe even a plea. She opened her mouth to sing the first note. Wait. My voice cut through the silence before I'd consciously decided to speak. I stood, the folder clutched in shaking hands, and every head in the audience turned toward me. I need to say something before the performance begins. Elena lowered the microphone slowly. I saw understanding dawn in her expression, and something that might have been relief. This composition, I began, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect, is not my father's work. The murmur that rippled through the audience was expected. I pushed through it. My father, Arthur Vance, built his career on music stolen from a composer named Eleanor Hayes. A woman whose entire body of work was plagiarized, whose name was erased, whose debut was canceled so that my father could premiere her compositions as his own. I walked to the stage, opened the folder, and held up the first page. Eleanor's original manuscript with my father's name scrawled over hers. This is the truth I've spent 6 years trying to avoid. The truth I discovered weeks ago and tried to bury. The truth that Eleanor Hayes herself has been trying to tell through the only means available to her. By completing the work she began 70 years ago. Someone in the third row stood to leave. Then another. But most stayed, frozen by the magnitude of the confession unfolding before them. The song you were about to hear is hers. Every note, every measure, every moment of genius, Eleanor Hayes. My father was a thief. His legacy is a lie. And I've been complicit in that lie because I was too afraid to choose truth over the comfort of inherited glory. I looked at Elena, who had tears streaming down her face. If you still want to perform this, it should be introduced correctly, as the work of Eleanor Hayes, a composer who deserved to be heard, a woman whom my father silenced, a ghost who refused to stay buried. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Elena nodded, lifted the microphone again, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of vindication. This is Eleanor Hayes's composition. May her name finally be remembered. She sang the opening note, and the melody that filled the venue was no longer stolen. It was a restoration. It was justice. It was the sound of a ghost finally, impossibly, being heard. The performance lasted 43 minutes. Some audience members left during the first movement, unable to reconcile the revelation with the man they'd known. Others stayed through sheer momentum, academic curiosity overriding personal discomfort. But by the final crescendo, the remaining witnesses sat in stunned silence, and when Elena finished, no one applauded. There was nothing to celebrate, only truth to absorb, history to rewrite, complicity to examine. We left through the back entrance without speaking to anyone. My phone buzzed continuously with messages I didn't read. The academic world I devoted my life to was already recalibrating, already determining how to process the scandal of Arthur Vance's exposed plagiarism and his son's public confession. Tomorrow, there would be investigations, angry colleagues, demands for the return of honors and awards. Tonight, there was only the cold November air and Elena's hand finding mine as we walked to my car. The drive back to the house felt longer than it should have. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? I destroyed my father's legacy and vindicated a ghost. Elena had performed the most emotionally devastating piece of her career to an audience that didn't know whether to condemn or praise her. We'd both crossed lines we couldn't uncross. The house was different when we entered. Lighter, somehow, though none of the lamps had changed. The oppressive weight that had saturated every room since I'd moved in had lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. I walked to the parlor, half expecting to see Eleanor at the piano, but the bench sat empty. The manuscript pages no longer glowed. They were just paper now, remarkable only for their content, not their supernatural origin. "She's gone," Elena said softly, standing in the doorway. I nodded, surprised by the grief I felt. Eleanor Hayes had haunted me, manipulated me, forced me into an impossible choice. But she'd also given me the chance to be better than my father, to choose truth over comfort, to hear a silenced voice and amplify it instead of burying it deeper. Elena crossed to the piano, ran her fingers along the keys without pressing them. "What will you do now?" "I don't know." It was the most honest answer I'd given in months. "Everything I built was based on a lie. I'll need to start over. Become something other than my father's defender. You could become yourself." She sat on the bench and gestured for me to join her. "Art Vance. Not Arthur's son. Just Art." I sat beside her, our shoulders touching, and for the first time in years, I reached for the keys without my father's ghost directing my hands. I played a single chord, simple, unpolished, entirely my own. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated. It was honest. Elena added a note, then another, building on my foundation. "What if we wrote something together? Not for your father, not for Eleanor. For us. A memorial," I said, finding a melody that felt like gratitude, like apology, like beginning. And more than that, her hands moved across the keys, creating harmonies I'd never have found alone. Something that acknowledges the past, but doesn't live there. Something new. We played together in the empty house, composing without pressure, without legacy, without the weight of stolen genius. The melody that emerged was imperfect and tentative, full of false starts and corrections. But it was ours. Born from honesty instead of theft, from collaboration instead of erasure, from two people who'd survived a haunting and chosen to create something tangible from its aftermath. The piano no longer felt like an accusation. Eleanor's silence wasn't absence, it was completion. She'd done what she came to do, forced the truth into light, reclaimed her voice, and left behind two people who finally understood the cost of stolen art. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows. Inside, we composed a new song. And for the first time since inheriting my father's house and his sins, I felt something that might, eventually, become freedom.